lovers of lore. Thank you for joining me for this installment of the Brothers War story. As has become the norm, we are jumping all over the place chronologically. So today's story takes place before the Temporal Anchor has been finished. In fact, the story starts out with Joda providing the plans for Urza's time machine to Saheeli. But Saheeli, unfortunately, wasn't capable of understanding Urza's design. So she ultimately decided to toss that aside and create her own machine instead, coming up with the Temporal Anchor. And it worked differently than Urza's machine. Instead of physically sending a person back in time, instead it would hold their body in stasis and just send their spirit. And Teferi was particularly pleased with this because he wanted to ensure that anyone who was sent back, namely himself, would be stopped from actually interfering in the past. Although we've seen just his spirit going back in the past was enough to make changes. But regardless, this is the concept. Just send the spirit back, hold the body in stasis, and to make this work, it actually requires also bringing in Kea to extend her ghost form over the Temporal Anchor. And then what happens from there is the Temporal Anchor feeds temporal energy into the Moonsilver Key, and then the Moonsilver Key feeds this magical energy into a coffin, which is where the individual who is sent back in time would be held. Now, the first time they tried to use this machine, it ended in disaster. In fact, it started to become a recurring problem. Every time Saheeli was sure she had the machine working, it would just malfunction for some reason. And it turned out, after investigation, that it was actually being sabotaged. So, after taking a further look, Kea was able to determine that it was actually a ghost that was responsible for it, and there was an artifact located where they were that was actually responsible for it. It was a black crystal orb in a cage of silver. And when Kea sees it, she says that they need to find Teferi and ask him why this orb is making ghosts. Now, the story at this point actually jumps over to the past of Saheeli's life, specifically over on Kaladesh, because when she was younger, she was actually kidnapped by Gonti. Now, if you don't know who Gonti is basically Lord of the Underworld on Kaladesh, and he's an Aetherborn, but he's a very unique Aetherborn. Aetherborn are already crazy to begin with because they're essentially creatures of pure magic that have incredibly short lifespans. At first, their bodies, you can see when you look at them that they're made out of pure magic, but as they age, they start to crumble and then they fall apart. So they are doomed to extinction, except Gonti is different. He has a magical artifact that actually sustains his being. So he basically, through his wealth and power, is able to continue his existence onward. But he's got a problem now. His Aether heart is failing. So Gonti ends up kidnapping Saheeli and telling her that she has to fix his Aether heart. She refuses because she obviously doesn't want to help a criminal overlord, but he explains to her that he has her family held hostage and shows her a piece of her mother's jewelry. So at that point, Saheeli agrees to help him and ends up fixing the heart. At the same time, she gets very excited about the technology involved, the actual magical artifact, but she doesn't want to let Gonti know that. And by the end of it, she saves Gonti's life, and it turns out that Gonti had already sent word back before she even agreed to help him to not actually harm her family. So there was no real danger to the family, and it ends in that scenario with everything being fine. But the knowledge that Saheeli has gained through tinkering with Gonti's heart will come in handy further on in this story. So the story continues with Kea and Saheeli looking for Teferi, but they're unable to find him. They do find Joda, however. He's talking to a cloud that's floating in the air. It turns out that Joyra is inside of it, and he is communicating magically with her. After the conversation ends, they then explain to him the ghost situation, and Joda asks a very good question. How exactly does this orb create ghosts? Kea clarifies, it's not creating ghosts. What it's actually doing is strengthening ghosts that were fading away. The longer a spirit stays around, the more they disappear. but this instead was feeding a lance of energy straight into the ghost. And it's been feeding on this energy for weeks. So Joda heads with them to check on the orb, and using magic, he finds Thran writing on it that says, "Go back to the beginning and greet me properly." Now, Kea just wants to kill the ghost and be done with it, but Saheeli wants to hear it out. So they start up the anchor again, intending to lure the ghost in. This story has some heavy Ghostbuster vibes for sure. They want to lure the ghost in. They start the anchor back up, but this time Saheeli's modified the anchor with an extra function that she specifically learned from Gonti's Aether Heart. It's this pulsing that is designed to keep a spirit more substantial. That's how she stopped his aether-born body from flowing away with the use of the Aether Heart. So she takes that magical concept, applies it cleverly to the temporal device, and she's basically able to put this ghost into a stasis where he has enough of a physical form that he actually forms into a man wearing lion armor. And Saheeli's trying to talk to him, but the ghost doesn't want anything to do with it. So he pulls out his ghost blade and actually slashes it through the temporal anchor now that it's physical. So he's able to get away from them that way. But Kea chases the ghost down, ready to destroy it. Saheeli arrives to ask what the ghost's name is. And then the ghost explains that he's actually General Sharaman. He was in charge of Urza's forces, but he's not going to let anyone restart Urza's war machine. He lost all of his sons, broken in his arms, destroyed by Mishra's dragon engines, and he's not willing to see this done to anyone else. And at this point, Kea's just not having it because he's not listening to reason at all. So she steps in and stabs him, but does the whole, "I'm going to take you down to the ground, whispering to you" sort of thing, where he asks if he's going to see his family in the afterlife, and she tells him that he will. And then when the ghost fades away, she's visibly shaken by what she's done, but it does mean the ghost is gone, and from that point on, there is no more sabotage being done to the temporal anchor, and it operates properly. So after that point, the next thing we get to see in the story is Joda taking this orb off to secretly investigate it further, and he ends up casting lightning magic on it. It's called the Starfield Orb, and when he casts this spell, he's transported into a pocket dimension that is a little cottage full of Urza's possessions. So we're talking all of his books, manuscripts, blueprints, but it actually goes much further than that. There's actually a Xantia in there. Turns out she's just a construct, not the original Xantia. And there's also a Mishra construct living in this cottage together. And at first, Mishra wants to destroy Joda, basically saying, "You do not meet the description of Teferi, therefore you shouldn't be here, we're going to destroy you." But Xantia holds him back long enough for Joda to explain that I'm actually a descendant of Urza. And so at that point, the constructs relax. They give Joda access to the entirety of the cottage. And the story ends off with Joda asking, did Urza leave any last words? And it turns out that he did leave last words. This was meant for Teferi to find. And it says, "Let us end our conflicts. We cannot afford to differ any longer." And that's how this installment of the story ends, my friends. I hope that you enjoyed it. Join us for the next installment tomorrow. In the meantime, go watch some more lore. If you love what we're doing here, support the channel on Patreon or through the channel memberships. And remember, my friends, lore is life.